Welcome to my channel. My name's Tony, and I'm a podcaster and a podcast coach. So if you just love listening and watching the podcasts, plus creating some content, consider subscribing to the channel. So today's video, in less than 5 minutes, I'm gonna go ahead and walk you through how to get your video podcast up and running as early as today. Now, personally, I'm a huge fan of podcasts. Now, of course, I'm biased being a podcast coach, but I could tell you that there's so many great benefits to having a podcast, not just for the monetization aspect of it, but having a podcast really just allows you to open up your mind a little bit more, especially if you're interviewing guests. Step one, how to start your podcast, is you want to choose a topic for your podcast. But you want to make sure it's something you're passionate about. Now, while I'm not a big fan of finding your niche because your niche could change year over year, think about what you could actually talk about on a daily basis. See, the reason why most podcasts fail is because they stop putting out episodes. So in order to make sure you don't fall down that negative path, you want to ensure that every single podcast episode you put out is something you enjoy talking about and you're not going to get sick of. So in my personal opinion, I would never start a podcast because you think it's trendy or maybe you think other people find it interesting. If you go down that path, most likely your podcast won't be around next year. In fact, statistically, even though there's over 2 million podcasts right now, 90% of those podcasts don't make it past episode 3. So step 2, setting up your recording equipment. Now, as you can see, I have a very minimalist, I think, setup for a video podcast. But if you want to start a podcast on a small budget, all you really need is a microphone and a camera, plus a way to edit the actual show. Now, for microphones, the one I'm using, this is a pod mic. And in my opinion, for $100, this thing is beautiful. But there's a ton of other great options out there that you can use. And just like everything else, if you want to check that out, I've linked everything in the description below. Now, when I first started, I simply used my iPhone and a voice memo app. But there's a lot of other ways now, especially in 2023, where you can not only record your podcast, but you can even interview guests virtually. So you don't necessarily have to have a studio like this. So it's very easy to do a podcast on a small budget. However, if you want to do a studio setup kind of like I have, you could think about maybe getting a recording device like a Zoom H1, or of course the newer version is Zoom H6. Now, even though that's a couple $100, it's well worth it because you can have multiple mics hooked up to that via XLR. And you would record everything into that device through a micro SD card, and then open up your computer and use some sort of editing software to edit that audio down. And as far as a camera, personally, the iPhones or Androids, they have fantastic cameras. You can easily have that camera as your main camera. Now, not surprisingly, there's a ton of other options if you want to have a bigger budget, maybe like the Rodecaster Pro or something like that, which is what I'm using now. I will say though, I've spent years in this industry and I've slowly upgraded my equipment at a time, starting from doing no video and just audio, all the way to the setup that you see today, which is a big podcast desk, multiple chairs, up to 4 mics, the Rodecaster Pro, a couple mirrorless cameras. So over time, I've spent more and more money based off the amount of viewers that I have. And unfortunately with a podcast, it's not a get-rich-quick scheme. So you're not gonna be making money right away. That's why the less money you spend up front, the better. Now, step 3. Choosing your hosting and distributor platform. So there's a lot of different platforms that you can use to host your podcast. Now, when you're hosting your podcast, just remember, all a podcast is a audio form that's on a website or a URL, what we call an RSS feed. So all a podcast is just a audio blog. So even if you have a website currently, you could just post that audio file to your website and you got yourself a podcast. Now, there's other steps you have to take if you actually use a website. For example, you have to submit that RSS feed to multiple platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, etc. But you only have to do that once. And then moving forward, every piece of audio that you put onto that RSS feed, it'll automatically go to those platforms. That's if you're using a website. Now, if you don't want to use a website, that's okay. Nowadays, you have Spotify for podcasters, Buzzsprout, Podbean, and a lot more that will actually host and distribute that RSS feed. So essentially you would upload that audio file to those websites and they would distribute it out amongst all the podcast platforms. That to me is probably the easiest way to do things if you're just getting started. A website's may be beneficial if you want to start monetizing your podcast for maybe merchandise, something that you necessarily can't sell on those other things that we mentioned, but you'll be able to sell it on your own website. That might be an option for you, but if you don't necessarily have a plan for that and you just want to have a podcast just to have some fun and have a podcast, I think those other distribution platforms might be the way to go. Okay, so step 4, record and edit your podcast. Now, when it comes to recording your podcast and figuring out what to say, personally, what I like to do is I like to write everything, whether it's in the Notes app or Microsoft Word or Google Doc, however you want to do it. You want it to be formatted in a certain way that's not only easy for you to understand, but you want to get good at storytelling. If you're kind of jumping around all over the place, they're not going to be able to keep up, and they're probably not going to listen to any more episodes. So you do want it to be structured in some aspect. Once you're happy with your podcast, all you have to do is take that audio file that we mentioned, along with the video file, and put it into an editing software, maybe like Descript, which is a great free platform you can use, or even CapCut, which some of you may have already heard. And for those advanced folks, you have Premiere Pro, Final Cut, but nowadays there's a lot of great ways that you could do it. Step 5. Publish your podcast. So once you're completely happy with your podcast after the editing, it's time to upload to that hosting platform. And usually when you're involved with these other hosting platforms, they give you some very easy steps on how to get your show out to the masses. All right, number 6, promoting your podcast. So this is probably the most fun, but to get people to listen to your podcast, you need to promote it. So if you're an introvert, that's okay. But if you're looking to promote your show and you want everyone to listen to it, you have to get good at promoting it on social media. So personally, what I like to do if you are going to have guests on your show, which that to me is probably the best way to not only grow your audience, but it also allows you to soak in all the good stuff there is to know about podcasting. And by that, I mean, when you interview guests, not only do you allow your listeners different perspectives from you, the host, and your guest, because not everyone's going to agree on everything, but you, the podcast host, you're going to learn so much more when you interview and talk to people. You're going to become better at public speaking. You're going to become better at just listening to people. Just speaking from experience, my very first episode was very hard to listen to and still is. From then all the way until where I'm at now, which is over 200 episodes, the difference in my demeanor, the way I talk to people, it's just overall, it's really helped me become a better person, I think. And if you want to know how to create your own podcast, I'll actually leave in the description below a link to my video course. And as a podcast coach for over 4 years, I could tell you that I've helped tons of people start their podcast and grow their podcast to become very successful. And lastly, I mean, if you got any value out of this, leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. I'd love to know what type of equipment you use. And if you want to know what type of equipment that you see around you, I've also left that in the description below. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I love talking about podcasts. And if you want to know more about podcasts, subscribe to the channel because there's going to be a lot more videos like this coming your way. So thanks so much. Good luck and happy podcasting, friends.